Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking to Dr. Shawn Weinberg about Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you have not listened to the New Year's Day episode and our holidays episode, that would be a good starter here because the Emancipation Proclamation was actually signed on January 1st. And so New Year's kind of has this, civic holiday around it. But Dr. Shawn Weinberg, when we are talking about Emancipation Proclamation, what is happening while this is written and what problem specifically is this trying to address? Because I think a lot of times people generalize what the Emancipation Proclamation did.
Yeah, and that's one of the things is sort of a myth about it that I wanted to sort of push back on. So what is happening is the Civil War is the sort of glib answer. And so what is the Emancipation Proclamation trying to solve? Two related problems. One is the United States is not just easily steamrolling the South, and there is a very real possibility the Union will lose the war. And that is something that Lincoln finds utterly appalling. Not so appalling that he's willing to suspend elections, which I think is really admirable. 1864, there are elections that will happen that Lincoln goes in expecting to lose. So if Lincoln's willing to cough up half the Union over elections, seems to me elections are pretty important. So there is that military issue, and that will end up being important when we talk about sort of why is this Emancipation Proclamation misunderstood in some ways. But the other issue, obviously, is that the ultimate cause of the Civil War is slavery. And so what, if anything, can legally be done about slavery? And the Emancipation Proclamation, as we'll dive into in a second, is quite nuanced in that because Lincoln recognizes that this is part of a war, and there are also constitutional constraints both on the federal government in general and on the executive more specifically. So the Emancipation Proclamation is trying to thread that sort of political constitutional issue while making sure that the Union can, in fact, win the Civil War.
So who is the intended audience for this? And what is Lincoln, who is he trying to persuade here?
Yeah. So the Emancipation Proclamation sort of proceeds in a couple parts. And there's also one piece of political context that I should have mentioned a second ago. In 1861, General John C. Fremont, who had been the Republican Party nominee for president in 1856. So he's a fairly big player. He is a general and he has control. His Union or his Army jurisdiction is effectively Missouri. And he issues an order calling for the emancipation of all slaves in Missouri. And Lincoln furiously countermands this, originally privately, and then the second memo is a public one because Fremont doesn't get the message. So he tries to give him a way to quietly do this, and Fremont, again, doesn't get the memo. And at the time, Lincoln gets criticized by a lot of abolitionists and skeptics of slavery. They say, look, Fremont's fighting slavery. This is good. And Lincoln says, this is in Missouri, which is Union territory. And so he is taking property, which under the laws of Missouri, slaves are. Lincoln doesn't like that, but under Missouri law, slaves are property. He is taking property from citizens some of whom are loyal, because Fremont's order is not just, directed to possible traitors or anything like that. And so Lincoln says, he's exceeding his orders from me. And because I don't think this is militarily necessary, he calls it dictatorship, actually, straight up quote, not like me putting a word in his mouth, in quotes. He says it is simply dictatorship. Fremont's order assumes the general may do anything he pleases, confiscate the lands and free slaves, this is a surrender of government. Can it be pretended that the government of the United States is a government of constitutions and laws when a general or a president may make permanent rules of property by proclamation, right? So he's very hostile to that. And so in the interim, Congress passes a set of confiscation acts, which potentially justify the Emancipation Proclamation, but probably not if you look at the I've read a bunch of different articles on this. Scholars disagree on this. I'm not convinced the confiscation acts formally justify what becomes the Emancipation Proclamation. But what Lincoln argues is, I mean, you know where the Emancipation Proclamation applies, right? Do you remember what its scope is? It's not the United States. If you look at it, like half of the length is a description of the territory where it applies. And he basically, and so what he does is in 1862, he says, South, basically knock off the war or I will emancipate all your slaves. And this is after he writes a famous letter saying, my goal is to preserve the Union. If I can preserve the Union and free no slaves, I will do it. If I will free all the slaves, I will do it. If I free some of the slaves to save the Union, I will do that too. And Lincoln gets hammered for this. Oh, he doesn't care about slavery. He's really, which of course, sitting in the desk drawer is something he's drafted saying, hey, South, end the war or I will terminate slavery in your areas. So you have a few months to make your choice here because you wanted the war to be about slavery. If you want to keep slavery, this is your one and only chance to stand down. And the South here's that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and they don't buckle. So on January 1st, 1863, after the Union has secured a military victory that means it doesn't look like a desperation move, he issues that. But it applies, if you read the text, to a bunch of states, Louisiana, except, and he goes through and lists particular chunks of Louisiana to which it doesn't apply, more states, and then he says Virginia, except for West Virginia, and then a list of other counties. So why are there all these weird specifications? Well, because Lincoln says, I do not have legal authority, like I said about Fremont, to end slavery in the Union. I don't have authority to end slavery where there is no military necessity. He says, I am doing this as commander-in-chief, basically as a battlefield rule. And so any of the places that the Union has firm control of, they have Eastern Virginia at this point, and they have basically New Orleans. He says, I'm not emancipating the slaves there. I have no legal authority to do it. I'm only doing this where the South is still in active rebellion to push them to basically to slaves fleeing to the northern lines reduces southern labor force, but many of these folks either want to work for the Union or enlist in the army. And so at one point, he basically tells somebody who's mad about the Emancipation Proclamation, like, all right, fine. You want me to unemancipate them? Give me the exact same number of people to go enlist in the army. You can't, then shut up, right? I mean, again, I'm being a little glib in his paraphrase, but he's saying, like, this isn't because I hate slavery. This is because of military necessity. And, he gets grief from Salmon Chase, who's in his cabinet, and says, why didn't you emancipate them everywhere? And he says, I specifically did geography because that's what's legally allowed. And then, or because that's what I think the Constitution allows. And then he gives a magnificent letter. It's a letter to Albert Hodges in 1864. It's, I think, one of Lincoln's best writings. And he says, look, I am naturally anti-slavery. I've always thought this. And yet the Constitution does not give the president a freestanding authority to implement his policy views like that. So even this thing that I care the most deeply about, ending slavery, I don't think I can just do it everywhere. And so that's why this thing has to be constrained in its scope to preserve the Constitution. So, and Lincoln is as good as his word because Congress very quickly wants to propose a Reconstruction Act that says slavery will be forever banned in any of the states that are part of this. And Lincoln vetoes it. And the Republican congressmen are furious. They say, Lincoln, like, you just emancipated slaves all over. Why can't we do this as a congressional policy? And he says, in war, the president has specific powers. Those powers end in wartime. and Congress is constrained by federalism in peacetime. And so that's why Lincoln pushes for, if any of you have seen the movie Lincoln, it's a slightly fictionalized, but on the whole, pretty good account. The end of slavery in America is not the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the 13th Amendment, which is why, I understand why Juneteenth was adopted because that was from the South when they received the Emancipation Proclamation. Constitutional stickler and me would prefer us choose the day when they ratify the 13th Amendment, because that's ultimately because Lincoln cares about the Constitution too when slavery is terminated. Obviously, numerically, the Emancipation Proclamation does most of the work. But to end slavery in the Union states requires either of those states to do it themselves, which they're trying to push through originally, just, hey, we'll throw some money at you. Hey, why don't you do this? But eventually, Lincoln solves the problem by having Congress pass and the states ratify an amendment that sets as federal policy nationwide the elimination of slavery, and it makes permanent the Emancipation Proclamation, since there had also been some fear that maybe those folks would have to go back to slavery at the end of the war. This is truly a wartime measure. So Lincoln solves the federalism problem. Lincoln solves the separation of powers problem. Lincoln solves the kind of temporal wartime problem by getting Congress to pass the 13th Amendment.
And I'm glad you mentioned Juneteenth. We will be doing an episode on that closer to the holiday. But it is, all of these things are tied together. And the Emancipation Proclamation gets rid of slavery in the rebellious states, but not in the Union. So we are going to, again, we're going to talk about the 13th Amendment. Why does this document, the Emancipation Proclamation, still matter?
Right. Obviously, slavery has been banned in the United States for 150 years. So in that sense, as what's it legally doing for us today? Obviously, it doesn't matter. But it does matter insofar as I think it shows a few things. One, it clearly shows that, it doesn't have a long list discussion of philosophy because they've been talking about it before, but slavery is inconsistent with, it strikes the most decisive blow against slavery is inconsistent with, we'll say, at least the spirit, American republicanism and institutions in the Declaration of Independence, and et cetera. I think it also shows, and this is a take that other people will have, Salmon Chase has a very different take on it. I think it shows the importance of the rule of law, even on your most pressing constitutional issues, right? It's so tempting for people to say, well, I know it's unconstitutional, but this thing is really important. And I take Lincoln's point in that Hodges letter, which is something echoing what he said in the Lyceum address. Slavery is a really big deal. I'm pretty sure it's a bigger deal than whatever policy problem somebody thinks they have today. And yet Lincoln still wasn't willing to break the Constitution over it. That the Emancipation Proclamation is tailored for legal integrity at the same time that it's making sweeping repercussions. And I think it also tells us why, to your preface, I think of the last podcast, why Lincoln is worth admiring. That he's not perfect. Lincoln is somebody who cares deeply about the American Constitution. He is somebody who cares, is fiercely opposed again to slavery, and shows also prudent statesmanship. Right? He gets grief when he initially writes the letter to the op-ed basically to Horace Greeley, saying we may not end up in slavery in this war, and he gets hammered for it. But that gives him the political credibility. And Frederick Douglass earlier on, we'll talk about Frederick Douglass's very complicated relationship to Lincoln. Douglass is very critical of him for a long time, but Lincoln recognizes that it's very different being a political theory professor or a pundit or a newspaperman, and actually having to make calculations about factions. Like, how do I keep Missouri in the Union? How do I keep Kentucky in the Union? How do I make sure that this doesn't look like a desperation move? So even the timing of the Emancipation Proclamation requires a lot of sort of canny thinking by Lincoln. So yeah, I think it shows us and why Abraham Lincoln is still worth admiring.
Dr. Beinberg, thank you for going through the Emancipation Proclamation. And listeners, if you are interested, we are absolutely going to do a 13th Amendment episode, but this is definitely worth, reading. I think Abraham Lincoln is such a thoughtful writer, and used to use him as an example of argumentative writing in my AP government classes because he gave specific reasons straight from the Constitution. So Dr. Beinberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.